So just to give you a bit of a summary of what happened at our industry launch event. So this is our second launch event, the first one with our industry collaborators and this one with our academic collaborators. So our Industrial Advisory Committee was set up and comprises of organisations that originally gave us support letters and then organisations that have since got in touch with us and said that they'd like to engage with the Supergen Energy Networks Hub. It is chaired by someone who used to work at Ofgem, Andrew Wright, and he's also recently taken up a position as chair at Durham University since leaving Ofgem. So he's got a really extensive history and understanding of the regulatory framework within which networks operate. So it's been great to have him on board. And our first meeting, we got some really good attendance from quite senior people in the organisations that joined us. So we had, from the government side, we had people from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We had people from the Foreign Commonwealth Office, and then organisations associated with government, but not part of government. I'm sure they would say they're not a government organisation. Energy Systems Catapult were there. We had someone from UKIRC, the UK Energy Research Centre. And then on the industry side, we had some utilities. So we had National Grid, npower, Northern Power Grid, Wales and West represented. And then non-utilities, but companies active in the energy sector. We had Siemens, Toshiba, Arup, Engie, just as examples of some of the participants on that day. So we have quite a few contacts on the mailing list who couldn't quite join us on that day. They're also inputting as and when, because we've got a mailing list set up and Andrew emails them regularly to ask for agenda items for our next event and to enable them to input some of our data collection for ideas. So in that very first meeting, we had some very energetic discussions and lots of involvement around these ideas of potential architectures as part of the shaping discussion. So our first half of the meeting was really reminding them of what we were doing and where we were up to. And the second half, we started talking about these possible 3 architectures that were part of the shaping element of the programme of research. And so we had one group talking about transnational or national architectures. That was one of the shaping. And they were also asked to think about this in the context of the 3 challenges. And the one that they focused on the most was really around societal and technology elements, particularly around cyber and the ways in which demand might change over time. So some of the outcomes here on the slide are in the context of not just what would transnational look like, but also how could that cope with changing demand profiles and potentially increased concerns about cybersecurity in a more connected infrastructure world in the future. So they talked a little bit about the system goals and therefore whether a transnational would actually meet those goals, and talked a little bit about interconnectors and how UK goals might interact with European goals and beyond. They said if we were to have something transnational, then how would those rules work and who would be in charge? How do we make sure that everything's joined up? Is it more than just a markets-based approach? Do we need some quite heavy regulation there in order to know that everyone's using the same rule book? So that governance issue was quite high. They also spoke a little bit about drivers to the approach, what kind of industry involvement, what kind of society involvement, who would want a transnational approach and how would that be driven forward? But some of those drivers were also around economics. Would it be cheaper to actually offer a transnational architecture? Some of the technologies that they spoke about were really around this concern about cyber and being more ICT enabled and smart and connected. And that led them to ask a particular question about Black Start and how would that work in a world that was more connected and smart. Security came up over and over, and there were also some concerns about the political risks to this approach in a more interconnected world where perhaps the rule book wouldn't enable everybody to achieve their political outcomes, but would enable everybody to achieve most of their political outcomes. So there would need to be some compromise there. So that was one group talking about transnational, and we had another group talking about this idea of regional or perhaps service-based approaches where the approach could be very localized. Again, they talked about drivers, but in this case, the drivers they considered could be much more local authority driven, much more driven by local targets and aspirations of the community, whether that's community driven energy systems or local authority driven energy systems. Because they were talking about small systems, they then started thinking about, well, how does that system ensure that there's enough diversity to enable supply and demand to match on a system that might have much less diversity because it's a lot smaller? So there was a discussion around, well, what is sufficient diversity? And they didn't come up with an answer, but it was a question that they were kind of posing to us and to think about as part of this approach that we were looking at for our shaping. The next thing they discussed was really around, if we were to move from something that we have now to something that is a lot more regional or local, does that mean that there's stranded assets? And if there are stranded assets, who pays for them? So that was an issue that they discussed in that session. And then they finished off by talking about risks and benefits. What might be risks to local approaches in terms of perhaps this diversity mix and the supply-demand matching, but benefits around meeting very specific needs of local communities and perhaps being able to take advantage of very local resources. Once we got onto the group that was talking about the differentiated or blended architecture, they also discussed quite a bit about the societal change element and as part of the challenge. But in terms of the shaping bit and the architecture that they were looking at perhaps a blended, so you could go for something that was, as Phil said before, something that was regionally quite specific for certain bits of the country, but could be very national in other places, very connected. So they started thinking about what is the best blend, and is that blend different for sectors rather than geography? So would you have a different approach to industry compared to domestic, for example? Is it better for industry to be more interconnected and domestic to be more local, and there's your blended? Was one of the things they were talking about. Certainly for the technology, they started thinking about, is technology actually a regional choice? Would you go for certain technologies where there's certain resources available locally? So if there's more wind resource, you would naturally have more wind turbines there. If you had more gas resource in certain places, would you then just stick with the technology of gas? And some of the questions they were asking were very much around markets and how markets might work in a situation where there was quite a mix of what was going on. Some local markets, some national markets, still perhaps some international markets. How would all that work and how would they link together, and could it work? And so some of the elements of the approach might be more appropriate to national and might be more appropriate to local, and they talked about which elements and therefore which markets might work. Devolution came up, and sustainability and self-sufficiency as part of perhaps a blended architecture where certain locations might want to be more self-sufficient and independent. And in terms of differentiation then, they were asking, really, what do we mean by that? And is it possible in an energy network? So there were quite a lot of discussions going on as part of those 3 groups that we had, talking about these 3 different architecture types. As a result of that exercise and that first meeting, we now have a group that are really interested in these 3 areas. And so what those organisations want to do is continue to engage with us and to talk to our academic community about these 3 architectures. So they're keen to feed into some potential working groups on these 3 architectures. The other things that they're keen to do with us as our partners in crime, as it were, is to influence the research priorities. So they're also keen to have some discussions about the Flex Fund and where it might be used and how we can prioritise the research questions moving forward. That means that they're keen to also be involved in Flex Fund applications and offer letters of support and be involved on advisory groups and be potential partners and engage with us on the research. So we're doing the research with them. And finally, we have these non-research themes, as we've mentioned before: equality, diversity and inclusion, early career researchers, industry, international, and demonstrator. And so we want to enable our industry partners to get involved in the non-research themes as well. So there's some great ways there of engaging with these industry partners. I'm sure we'll talk about that some more when we come to the exercise talking about the 3 architectures later this afternoon. Before I hand over to Keith, I just want to say that straight after the break, we have got a session about the Flex Fund, and as part of that, Robin's gone very interactive and requires you to connect to the internet. We have Wi-Fi codes for people who don't want to use their own data. So if you haven't picked up a Wi-Fi code, do it over the tea break, because Robin's going to get you voting for different options as part of his interactive session with Peter on the Flex Fund. So make sure you can access the internet for that session. He's asked me to remind you. So just to summarise, our industry partners are really keen to engage, not just with the co-investigators, but with the whole community. They want to do that through the Flex Fund, through the research that we've identified, and through potentially 3 working groups that we're hoping to set up as a result of today. So please engage with us. It enables you to engage with them and enables, as a community, for us to do something that's more informed by and leading to outputs that benefit the needs of our industry partners.